done specifically on Americans' views on abortion, and more sort of within that context, especially looking at sort of the interaction of abortion and religion. I'll sort of start off big picture by giving you a sense. We did a report that sort of spent a lot of time looking at this and asked a lot of sort of detailed probing questions on how people thought about the issue. And that's the title we came up with for the report, America's Abortion Quandary. So just the title gives you a sense of what we're dealing with. Like, this is not a straightforward story. This is not a simple black and white, everyone thinks this or everyone thinks this. There are sort of deep cleavages within the country on this issue, and within individuals. There are conflicting sort of poles. People have, well, I think about it this way from a moral perspective, I think about it this way from a legal perspective. Or I think about it this way for myself, I think about it this way for someone else. So these are the sorts of things that we really unpacked. So I'll spend maybe 15 minutes or so talking about some of the highlights from the report, and then we can talk about, sort of go more in depth about this. I could talk about some other things that the report explored. And I'll also sort of briefly give you a sense toward the end of the report, the end of the presentation, about what are some of the patterns that we actually see of who's having abortions in the United States, how many are people having, how has that changed over the last few decades, those kind of questions. So let's start off with sort of how, is abortion a religious issue? For most Americans, no. So we asked this question, we said, how important are your religious views in shaping your views about abortion? And you see about a third of Americans say that their religious views are either extremely important or very important in their views about abortion. But it's also worth noting that there are some pretty significant differences by group. So it's not, does this work? If you turn it on, does it work? Even if you turn it on, it does not work. All right. So I think no one will be surprised that among religiously unaffiliated Americans, their religious views are not what's driving their views about abortion. Only about 7% of religiously unaffiliated Americans say that religious views are important. On the other hand, white evangelical Protestants, which are one of the more religious groups in the U.S., about 3/4 say their views about religion and influence their views about abortion. Interestingly, black Protestants are about as religious by nearly all of our measures, church attendance, Salem Lord's Prayer, as white evangelicals, but they're significantly less likely to say that religion influences their views on abortion. So this isn't just religious people say it's important. There's an aspect of that, but even among religious people, there are some differences depending on the religious group, the tradition, what the tradition says, how people interpret the tradition, what people prioritize within the tradition. There's a partisan gap here, which is linked to some of the partisan patterns on affiliation, which maybe you guys talked about last time. If not, we can talk about in the Q&A. What there's not is much of a gender difference on the role of religion in shaping views. It's also, interestingly, there's not a huge gender difference in views on abortion, whether it should be legal or not, whether it should, whether it's moral or not.
Can I just ask, so you didn't include other religious groups in it?
Oh, we did. When we say total, this is going to include everybody, regardless of religious group. What you'll see, I suspect this came up in the previous set of presentations as well. What you see here are the groups that are large enough for us to look at them separately. So, for example, Muslims are in this group, Jews are in this group, or in the total. Muslims are in this total, Jews are in the total. There aren't enough of them for me to tell you, okay, so this is what Muslims think. We only talk to maybe 30 of them. And so I'm not comfortable pulling that out and saying, well, here's what Muslims think about that. We talked to lots of white evangelicals, talked to lots of Catholics. And again, that just has to do with the size of those groups in the US, which we can talk about more if that's not something that was covered sufficiently last cycle. So here's another way to sort of look at this same question about the role of religion and people's views on abortion. So we saw before that certain groups do say that religion's important, and there's some patterns there by religiosity and by some other things. What does that? Where do they fall on this question of whether it should be legal, which is often the focus of most of the polling in the United States. The question that mostly is being asked, people are being asked to weigh in on is, should abortion be legal? What should the law say about this issue? Like I said, in our study we did a number of other things, but the pattern that you're going to see the most often, if you're just sort of looking at the newspaper or whatever, is going to be this question of, what should the law say? Which is different from, what do you personally believe, what would you personally do? But it's the sort of, and it tends to be in a pretty broad pattern. Should it be legal all the time? Should it be legal some of the time? But should it be legal all the time? Should it be legal most of the time? Should it be illegal most of the time? Or should it be illegal all of the time? And so when you break things down that way, what you see is the people who say religion is most important are the ones that are the most likely to think that it should be illegal. And furthermore, they're the most likely to say it should be illegal in all cases. Although even among that, only about a third say it should be illegal in all cases. Of the people who say that religion is extremely important in their views, about a third say it should be illegal in all cases. Another 50% say it should be illegal in most cases. On the other side, people who say that religion is not playing an important role in their view are much more likely to say that it should be legal in all cases or most cases. So this is a pattern that we see on the way in which sort of the role of religion in making this decision affects or is linked to what sorts of views people have. But all of this is really about the question of what should be legal. And that's a little different from the question of whether or not people see it as a moral good or ill. And so we actually asked people these questions. We said, are there situations where abortion is morally wrong, but you still think it should be legal? So, are you comfortable making this distinction between, okay, this is something that I don't think is right, as opposed to this is something that I don't think the government should allow? And what we see is about half of the public says that there are situations where they think abortion is morally wrong, but the government should allow it anyway. And then the rest of the public is split relatively evenly between people who say that no, if it's morally wrong, it should be against the law, and people who say it's just not morally wrong. So, there's not room for a disconnect because this isn't a moral problem. So there's sort of, the rest of the public sort of evenly split between those two. And what you see here is that it varies, by party it varies a little bit. By religious group it varies a little bit. But, if you remember, I sort of flagged white evangelicals as the group that were most likely to say their views were influenced by religion. They're the most likely to say that it should be illegal in all or most cases. Even among that group, half of them, a bit more than half of them, say that there are situations where abortion is morally wrong, but should still be legal. Really, the groups where it drops significantly below half are groups, like atheists, agnostic, where large groups just don't see it as a moral issue. There's never very many people that are in this category that say, whenever it's morally wrong, it should also be illegal. That's sort of the minority opinion across all groups. So there definitely are people that are in that view, about 22% of the public, in fact, but it's the minority view across groups. And I think one of the reasons why you see that, is the point that that my colleague Greg talked about, which is this sort of distinction between sort of religion and government, right? And the fact that many people feel that's important to maintain. But the other reason, I think, is that people are themselves cross-pressured on this issue. People are themselves conflicted. And one of the ways that we can see that is we asked people whether they agreed or disagreed with a number of statements. And then we sort of looked at the ways in which two of them in particular interacted. One of the statements is human life begins at conception. And so a fetus is a person with rights. And we asked people, how well does this statement describe your views? Very well, somewhat well, not at all well, etc. And then the second question was, the decision about whether to have an abortion should belong solely to the pregnant woman. Again, same thing. This describes my view very well, somewhat well. And we sort of juxtapose these two because in a lot of the sort of public discussion, these are treated as sort of the opposite poles of the conversation, right? Either you believe human life begins at conception, or you believe abortion is a decision that the woman gets to make on her own. What we saw is that's just not the way many Americans see it. In fact, a third of Americans agree with both of these. And then you have people who sort of lean more toward one or the other, and a fairly small minority, they're like, yeah, neither of these have anything to do with me. But there's a sizable group, a third of Americans, that feel a pretty significant pull to both of these statements. And so this is the point. This is one of the points that we're sort of drawing on when we make this point about sort of America's abortion quandary, about the fact that people feel sort of pulled in different directions. And so the rhetoric may be, look, everybody's in this camp, or everybody's in this camp. But it turns out that what the data tells us is that lots of people are sort of torn and like, well, I see a point here, but I also see the point here. And so I'm not sure what that means for me personally. And I'm certainly not ready to sort of make definitive statements about what the law should be based on this. Well, it's kind of this and it's kind of that. So going back to the legal question, though, this is the pattern that we've seen. Views on abortion have actually been relatively stable for some decades. We've been asking, or different groups, including us, have been asking this for going on 30 years. And there's been some fluctuation, as you can see, but it's pretty consistently been the case that about 6 in 10 Americans, so a majority, but not an overwhelming majority, believe that abortions should be legal in all cases or in most cases. And about 36% say abortion should be illegal in all cases or in most cases. And this is often the way in which these views are sort of reported. Most of the public says abortion should be legal in all or most cases, or a third of Americans say abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. And as you can see from here, that's true. And that's been fairly true going back almost 30 years. But as has been hinted at with some of the, and here's sort of the sort of summary of that recent, here's the way you split up the public. 61%, about 2/3 are over in this camp, third are over in this camp. But as some of the other data has shown, that's a way to split up the public. But the public actually breaks out into much smaller pieces, right? So sure, I can ignore this line and this line and like, here's a group. And I can ignore this line and this line and say, here's a group. And that gives you, some information. But, I could decide to ignore different lines, right? So now I'm looking at, these are the people that say that there are no exceptions. They say legal no exceptions, these are illegal no exceptions, but these are the no exceptions people, 27%. There are exceptions. Sometimes it's legal, sometimes it's not. That's 71%. So, again, there's two groups. And so if you circle back, it's still this same data. It's just I'm picking different lines to focus on. If I focus on, I ignore this line and group these folks, and ignore this line and group these folks, I get one story. If I ignore this line, and this line, and group these guys, I'm telling a different story. But the respondents have told us the same thing. Their views are the same, and their views are complicated. The question is, what story are we telling? We've sort of drilled down on this question, these issues, a bit more. If we look at specifically the people who say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, what we wanted to know is, okay, what does that mean? What does most cases mean? Right? Or even what is all cases? You say all cases, do you mean all cases? And it turns out no. We actually had one follow-up. We asked people, do you think abortion should be 4 options, legal in all cases, most cases? And the ones who said legal in all cases, we had a follow-up question. We said, are there any exceptions? About half of them said yes. The people who said illegal in all cases, are there any exceptions? About half of them say yes. So even folks who are like, in all cases, well, not really all. He said all, but I didn't like every single one. And so, these are the sorts of things that you start to unpack. Like, what do these statements mean? And so, the people who said it should be legal in most cases or all cases, we asked some follow-up questions. Should how long a woman has been pregnant matter in determining whether abortion is legal or illegal? Most said yes. How long a woman has been pregnant, that's a factor that we should be thinking about. Is this week 2 or is this week 32? And we have some follow-up questions that wind up being really complicated about at what point people draw lines. I'm not going to present that because those questions are complicated. And we require some time to discuss why it's complicated. But long story short, most people who think that abortion should be legal, generally, say that how long a woman has been pregnant should matter. But even in terms of going beyond that to say, well, where are the lines? People struggle with that. We asked, should doctors or abortion providers be required to notify the parents or legal guardians if a person under 18 is seeking an abortion? Now again, we're talking just about folks who said it should be legal in most cases or in all cases. Most say yes, it should be legal, but if someone's under 18, parents should be notified first. You shouldn't be able to do it without a parent's permission. And this is that other question, how well does the statement describe the views? Human life begins at conception. And we see about 1/3 of the people who say that abortion should be legal go on to say, I believe human life begins at conception. So again, it's this, we're looking at these folks who usually are camped in these are the people who say legal. It's like, well, yes, but you ask them more, you give them a chance, they'll tell you a lot more. The same is true for the flip side. about, among the people who say it should be illegal in most or all cases. What about if the pregnancy threatens the woman's life or health? Well, in that case, only 27% of this 37% say, oh, well, in that case, it should still be illegal. So most of these people say, well, if the pregnancy threatens the woman's life, that's a different story. What about if it's the result of rape? Again, most of these people are like, well, in that case. Now, it's worth noting here that there are 3 response options. There's legal, there's illegal, and there's it depends. This is another one of those things that as we were developing these questions, as we were testing, as we were looking at the literature, it was clear that even when you give a scenario, you're like, okay, I'm giving you the scenario. Now what do you think? Like, well, what about? You have to tell me this other thing, and this other thing, and this other thing. Well, it's the result of rape. Okay, it's the result of rape. But is it the result of rape and we're at week 35? Because at that point, I have a different view. Is it as a result of rape and this person just found out? Or pregnancy threatens the woman's life or health. Well, how big a threat is it? These are the kinds of things that we're hearing. Which is why, even when we're giving people these scenarios, we have to put this "it depends" response. And you see, "it depends" pops up pretty frequently. Like, okay, we've told you this is the scenario. What do you think? Well, it depends. You'd have to tell me more to give you an actual situation. And what's interesting is it's not necessarily that these are people that are trying to I don't want to answer the question or haven't really thought about it. Often they have very nuanced views. If you really sat down with them and said, okay, here's the situation. This is how old the person is. This is how long they've known. This is what we know about the child. They're like, oh, well, in that case, yes. Well, in that case, no. But I'm not going to, in a survey questionnaire, give you, 5 minutes worth of details. And so you've got to give them the option to say, well, you'd have to give me more details than you're willing to. And then here's this last thing. It's sort of the flip of the point I was making before. How well does the statement describe your views? The decision about whether to have an abortion should belong solely to the pregnant woman. Again, these are among people who say it should be illegal in most or all cases. 41% say that this statement, the decision should belong solely to the pregnant woman, describes their views, at least somewhat well. So, again, it's this sort of okay, I have a view about what the law should be, but I also feel like women should be empowered in a certain way. And so these are the tensions that we see within individuals, and that aggregate up into the tensions within society. Now, just as a quick last point, because I spent more time on this than I originally intended. This is the pattern in terms of how many abortions have been conducted in the U.S. over the last 50 years or so. Now, we go back to 1973. Anyone have a guess why 1973 is where we're starting there?
Moral majority comes in, the religious right starts to become active, there's feminism, there is lots of social changes.
So there are definitely a number of social changes that are happening at that point. But there's one very specific point, which is
Roe v. Wade.
Yes. So 1973 is the point at which the Supreme Court weighs into the discussion of abortion legality and says states are not allowed to ban abortions. Before that, there were states in which it was just illegal to have an abortion. And in 1973, the Supreme Court says, nope, you can't do that. And so from that point on, the government starts collecting data, a number of private organizations start collecting data about how many people are having abortions. Trying to collect data before that, you're collecting data on what may be an illegal activity. And so that just introduces a whole new set of sort of difficulties. But from that point forward, what we're talking about is an activity that's legal in all 50 states. And so the question is, what are the patterns? And what we see is, for a couple decades, a pretty significant sort of year-over-year increase in how many abortions are being conducted between 73 and about 1990. And then, for the last 3 decades, a pretty consistent decline in how many abortions are being had. And that holds up until, it's just sort of worth noting, this data only goes up to 2020 because collecting administrative data always lags me by a few years. That's just welcome to administrative data. You know, nobody has the 2022 data yet or the 2023 data yet. So the data we have here is up till 2020, and that's just the most recent data out there. But what you see is, for year over year, you see this pretty consistent decline, regardless of the various changes in law that are happening at the state level, regardless of various Supreme Court rulings. You know, Casey happens, where the rules on abortion restrictions are changed by the Supreme Court. States start to do, add their own restrictions. We have conservative majorities, we have liberal majorities, we have Democratic presidents, we have Republican presidents. Regardless, we continue to see this steady decline. That only starts to change in the last couple of years. And whether or not, the extent to which this is a real change is somewhat up in the air. Like, it could be that this is a one-off blip and you start running into COVID and all kinds of weird things happen. But one thing, but there's at least the potential that we're seeing something of a change here. And one of the reasons why some commentators have said that this may be the case is because there's been some significant changes in technology and in the ways in which, and law, and in the ways in which abortions are conducted. In fact, only in the last few years has there been a significant shift from what are typically called surgical abortions to what are called medicational abortions. So, without going into a lot of detail, there's a number of ways in which abortions can be conducted, and in recent years there's been a shift toward a series of a series of drugs that that can induce the abortion without having to go through sort of a medical procedure. And there's ongoing legal conversations, administrative conversations about how those should be regulated. But that shift has had implications in terms of access. That's pretty clear. But yeah, we'll have to wait until sort of additional administrative data comes out, till the dust settles around COVID, et cetera, before we can see whether or not this shift is something real and sustained, or if there's just something specific about that year or a couple years. But there's at least a conversation that there may be something happening there. And then there's just, I had some additional data about which women have abortions, but I'll skip that in the interest of time. We can circle back to it if it's something that people are interested in. So yeah, I'll stop here to leave time for a conversation. If you're interested, basically everything I've covered is in that report that I referenced at the beginning, America's Abortion Quandary. So you can search that and you'll find all that information and then a lot more. And then there's another report that we did that about abortion views, about abortion that has a lot of detail about specifically the administrative data. So with that, I'll open up for questions. How long do we have for questions?
About 15 minutes.
About 15 minutes for questions.